Welcome back to Family Twist. Imagine discovering as an adult that the family story you've believed your entire life isn't true. That's the premise of Myth of the Ghost Kingdom, a powerful independent film that follows a woman who discovers she was adopted and sets out to discover the truth about who she really is. But unlike so many movies that use adoption or DNA surprises as a plot device, this one stays with the emotional aftermath, the questions, the identity shift, the complicated search for answers. Today's guest is the film's writer and director, Jason Mullis. Before he ever wrote the screenplay, Jason spent months listening to adoptees and late discovery adoptees to make sure that he got it right. In this conversation, Corey and Jason talk about why so many people have experienced a DNA surprise, say they always felt different long before they knew the truth, the responsibility of telling someone else's story with authenticity, and why identity can be every bit as powerful as any Hollywood plot twist. And if you're a horror fan like we are, you'll also hear us explore why this subject could make for an incredible psychological horror film without ever losing sight of the humanity at its center. Here's our conversation with Jason Mullis.
Hello, Jason. Welcome to Family Twist.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Kendall recorded an episode a few months ago with a late discovery adoptee named Keith Chirillo, and he talked about the movie. And so I just kind of wanted to give you a little bit of a synopsis of what he said, because he really wanted to make sure that the movie was mentioned in his episode. So Keith says, Myth of the Ghost Kingdom is about a late discovery adoptee, and even though it's a fictional film, it captures the experience so authentically. You could tell the filmmakers did their research. I watched it 3 times before it was released, and now that it's on Amazon Prime and Apple TV, I want as many people as possible to see it because it truly reflects what so many of us have lived.
That's a huge relief. I definitely want to follow up with you and get that person's name and write them a nice thank you, because as you can imagine, when you're thinking about doing a movie like this and it hasn't been your personal experience, you've got to be really careful. You've got to hold, at least I feel like you have to hold strong responsibility to be authentic. And as we promoted the movie, there has been some skepticism from the community, which I encourage. I think generally speaking, what I'm trying to do with indie movies is tell stories from the worldview of someone who's underrepresented. And when I first started researching the project, over and over again, people talked about how specifically for a late discovery, I didn't really ever consider a narrative besides late discovery, how underrepresented the show, like we're often just kind of a plot point in a TV show, and it never really scratches the surface. Obviously, I want to make a good movie, but that was the top priority to me, was we need to make sure someone who's experienced this feels like we have at least made a huge amount of effort to make it authentic. And, you know, the way that I did that, and I want to thank you and your partner, was listening to a lot of podcasts. I tried to cast and hire actors and crew that had experienced it. We were lucky enough to have a couple of people involved that could talk about it at length. I believe you're a writer as well, correct?
I am, yes.
And so, you know, you and I probably have a similar experience where we're cornered at a cocktail party and someone says, I have this great idea for a book or this great idea for a screenplay. And my experience, I don't know if they're the same for fiction writing, most of the time I'm presented with what someone thinks is a really unique plot twist, but it doesn't have like a worldview. And it's really, really focused on plot. The thing that sticks out to me, whether you're talking about Family Twist or some of the other podcasts, the people who on there know their story so well based on thinking about it and knowing the most compelling elements to it. And they're so authentic. And by the way, I listened to your most recent podcast. Julie was so supportive of the movie when we released it. And it was just such serendipity to come on earlier this week and see, I was like, this person sounds familiar. And look at, and someone who embraced us with open arms, and just her story, so compelling. The first time I'd heard her talk about it, I read some of her reading.
I totally understand why there would be some skepticism from the community about a
should be
a fiction, right? Because they've been burned before, right? But I love hearing that about Julie.
the danger of cinema, in my opinion, and I do believe we're in a bit of a recession, is to become very gimmicky and not, use that as a plot point or say that someone is either adopted or late discovery and not really ever diving into that and then making it an action movie or so on and so forth. And, it's something that, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Ghost Kingdom or something I do in the future. To me, you owe any community you're telling a story about the responsibility of being credible and honoring them, if that makes sense.
And one of the things that Kendall and I have been talking about, and of course, I'm sure you're the same way, you got, like 18 projects in different stages of development going at the same time. But because we're such huge horror movie fans and we've got our, our Horror Heals podcast, we kind of been like brainstorming ideas between each other. Like, what about a horror movie from an adoptee angle, that would be as realistic as, the story, but how do we tie horror into that? And so we got actually an idea that I think is pretty solid that I'll just leave it at that.
I'd love to talk to you about it because it's interesting that you mentioned that, because specifically when I was researching it, I don't think the average person understands the psychological experience. Had it been my experience, I think I would have felt comfortable pushing it into the territory of straight ahead psychological thriller or horror. And Myth was attempting to do a drama or a psychological drama with horror grammar, if you will. And if you've seen a movie like The Humans is a brilliant example of using horror grammar, but it's not actually a horror movie. And I think the more you start thinking about that, I'd love to see what you've developed. I think that as long as you can tell yourself you're being authentic about the character, the genre doesn't matter, right?
Well, we've had, dozens of adoptees and NPEs and donor conceived people on the podcast. And one of the common things that you hear is, I always felt different. I always felt a little bit off, but I couldn't explain exactly why. Why do you think so many people experience that feeling way before they even find out the truth?
When I found the term Ghost Kingdoms, that's when I knew that I had a concept that would be very helpful to people to understand what the theme was like. Are you familiar with Peggy Jean Lipton?
The name sounds familiar.
I believe it's Lipton who talked about adoptees when they're taken away from their mother at birth. There's this permanent wound that they're not even necessarily in touch with, but it's there.
Yes.
Right?
The primal wound, yeah.
Now, a person who's gone through a more traditional process with adoption and their adoptive parents have been transparent and so on and so forth, they still have the wound, right?
Yeah.
But I guess, it's hard to say how much of a shock is it when you grow up knowing, right? But I've heard what you said over and over again with every podcast where it was just too constant. It was like, I always knew. And then one of the actresses, Linnea, who has a role in the movie, she is late discovery. And she's like, oh yes, I knew. She was generous enough to sit and talk with me a couple of days about making sure this was authentic. And I said, I keep hearing you always know. And she said, I always knew. That she didn't know exactly, but she always knew something was off, and from what I've read and seen, it's like 95% of the time. You think that's accurate?
I know a lot of our guests have talked about after the discovery, this sense of losing their identity, losing who they thought they were. And I know that's a theme that you explore in the movie. Can you talk a little bit about why that was important?
So this is the cinephile portion of the interview. I'm a huge fan of a Polish filmmaker. His name is Krzysztof Kieslowski. In the 90s, he did a trilogy called Three Colors, blue, white, and red. They're supposed to represent the French flag. And the first one stars Juliette Binoche, and it's specifically about identity. And so when I was thinking about what I was going to do at the time, I knew that I really wanted to do an identity piece. And again, I didn't start with late discovery, right? I read a couple of articles. I think it was in 2019. I read an article where 10% of the people who were going on to 23andMe or Ancestry were discovering that, oh, I have this half first cousin, or, oh, this is telling me this is my dad. But again, it's not always the parent, the biological mom or dad, but they're seeing that, their family tree is not, 100% what people are talking about at Christmas time, right?
Right.
And, that was it clicked with me, like, this is as big as identity gets, right? That you're a full-grown person, and in some ways you've kind of begun to take for granted your identity, right? Because you've lived in this family for so long, and then you realize, wait a minute, half of this is completely fabricated or constructed, right? And so when I had that kind of eureka moment that, if you want to do something about identity, if you want to, this is a perfect narrative. And again, we were always planning it to be low budget. And, that's the thing about something like Myth of the Ghost Kingdom. It's this tension that someone's feeling that it doesn't take a lot of, I knew I didn't need a Marvel movie budget to portray it, right? And so it just seemed like if we can figure out the key scenarios that these people go through consistently that are almost universal to them and script it that way, we might really have something.
I know a lot of the folks that we've talked to, even after they've discovered their biological family and they've formed relationships with them and learned more about their history, there's still this question in the back of their mind of, who am I? Who am I really? How did you want the audience to sit with that concept?
So that's a really good question. And I think I would always lean more on what consistently you hear from someone who's experienced it is, they finally have some answers, but it doesn't make things perfect. It doesn't make you feel whole, right? And it was very important to me that the conclusion, again, reverting back to what we talked about initially, I think the things that a lot of people struggle with when they see adoption portrayed in media, whether it be a movie or anything else, is this almost this light touch that everything's going to work out as the movie's ending, right? And I wanted, it's like, I think the best quote I ever heard from someone who's a late discovery was, when you connect, it's great, but, working your way into their life is complicated. It's like you're invited to the party, but you have to bring your own chair. It's not perfect. What I kept seeing in terms of the narrative was this strong desire to have question answers, right? And then you have a reunion that can go horribly wrong, right? But sometimes, even in the best case scenario, the reunion is just life-changing. But then things, the relationship long-term will take work and it can get awkward, right? So we were very careful about that, not to suggest that this is this perfect happy ending for someone and now she feels whole. Right?
Yeah. When you were doing your research for this, what were the surprising things about adoptees? Not necessarily just those who found out later in life, but just adoptees in general and adoption. Was there anything that was kind of shocking for you?
The biggest shock to me was how the absurdity oftentimes the discovery was. Where, from what I've read, and again, I want to be careful, I don't have the statistics, but reading articles, listening to podcasts, someone might find out at a funeral. Referencing your other podcast again in terms of horror, horror often, or the thriller genre is often about someone realizing that things aren't what they seem, right? I was very, very careful not to make the discovery overly dramatic, but it plays out, in so many different ways, like I said, at a public event, or they stumble upon, documentation, or I remember reading about someone saying that when he was an adolescent, like at 19, and he was having issues with stress, his doctor just blurted out to him, do you think it might be because you're adopted? He'd never had a discussion with his parents about it. So seeing that over and over again, we knew we wanted to nail that moment and make it subtle, as well as make sure we were being authentic about the rest of the family. The person who's mainly helping the protagonist in Myth of the Ghost Kingdom is an aunt named Aunt Tracy. And she has to confess, look, I never thought this was right, but it was my business. I had to play along with the game. This is the narrative your mother wanted. You were your mother's child. And despite the fact that I didn't think this was the right way to do it, I didn't have a choice.
Well, Jason, as a listener to the podcast, I'm sure you've heard our tagline, which is family secrets are the ultimate plot twist.
Correct.
As an outsider looking in and knowing more now than you did before you started this project, why do you think families keep these secrets for decades, even if they believe they're rooted in love or good intentions?
In terms of the family dynamic, it depends. I think that there's another podcast, I believe it's about late discovery, which is called Sex, Lies, and the Truth. And one of the things that they laid out, which I do think is probably accurate, generally speaking, when the adoption is hidden, somewhere in the dynamic is someone who would probably be described as narcissistic. And it's all about their pride and how they, want the story to be and so on and so forth. But again, when you talk about, family and how this type of information is transferred, I think a lot of people just assume that someone knows they're adopted, but they aren't comfortable bringing it up, right? I think that that's the thing about it, that it is an absolutely absurd assumption, but obviously it happens a lot, right? It's just not talked about. I think that when you talk about any dysfunction or toxicity in family, there's always going to be a considerable amount of people ignoring it, right? Or just going along.
So you mentioned earlier, that it's not always easy making an independent film like this. And I know that there are a lot of filmmakers have to make a lot of difficult decisions, when they're working with a limited budget. Was there an aspect of the story or a scene or something that you really thought, I've got to keep this in no matter what?
In Myth of the Ghost Kingdom, Abby, the protagonist, the parent, is deceased. I got a lot of criticism from people who, claimed, you're giving up so much trauma by having the mother be deceased. And, I would always say, well, I think that that's one side of it, that, you are giving up some drama, but it's, that's where it also gives the protagonist license to explore and to become active. I think that we ultimately made the right choice, because I was also really worried about making the adopted mother the villain in uppercase, right?
Yeah.
There was a considerable amount of debate about that, but we landed on it. It makes the most sense that she's deceased. It also, with her being deceased for a couple of years, it makes sense for her, daughter to stumble upon certain things. But more than anything, it was more about, is this as authentic as it should be? Is this really accurate to the story that we're trying to tell? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think you made the right decision because it's grounded in reality. I mean, I don't know how many times we've heard, people, they get the search or their search angel or whatever, and they get to that discovery and they're gone.
Is it more common for them to search and the person is gone on average?
It depends on the age of the person, but a lot of people that are taking these tests now are, in their 50s and 60s. And so, yeah, I mean, it is relatively common. Or, they get a limited amount of time with them. Kendall's birth father just died last month. While we got 8+ years to know him, his mental health has really been in decline ever since we met him. So it was like we had a very short amount of time where we got to feel like we were bonding with someone who was able to carry on a conversation and tell stories and things like that. So,
right. And for clarity, Kendall was not late discovery. He knew, okay.
He's always known. Yeah, always known. But then it was a closed adoption in Arkansas. So, as much of his adoptive parents would have been encouraging for him to find his birth family, there literally was not an opportunity until the DNA testing came along.
Right. And I'm glad you bring that up because that was another catalyst. After reading the 23andMe, obviously I researched more. I came to the conclusion of how much shorter the discovery rate, because the first couple of things I read about is like, say in the 90s, you might look for 10 years and get nothing. Whereas now, if Kendall started today, do you think it would have been easier or would have been taken just as long?
Oh, I think it would have been definitely easier. Yeah,
Okay.
for sure. But, it was also just the same year, happy coincidence that I got Kendall the ancestry test and his brother Chris's wife, Karen, got him the ancestry test. It's not on everybody's radar. So
No.
I think DNA angels do an amazing job, especially if they can find a really robust obituary. I mean, I know people have been able to have success outside of taking a DNA test, but it's definitely challenging. Well, one of the things that just came to mind was, we've had several guests who have found out, late discovery, mom's still alive, the adoptive mom is still alive, or the birth mother's still alive, and says, I don't want you to find out until after I'm gone. Well, that could be a long time. Let's say you're waiting 6 or 7 years, and then you take a test or you do your research and you find out that dad died a year and a half ago.
There's no way it would be rational, but I do think it would be wild to have someone explain why they decided, I don't want you to find out until I'm gone. It just boggles the mind. But, what I can say is once I started talking to people about what we were doing, the average person doesn't realize how this is every extended family. One of my favorite stories, I was negotiating the Airbnb we were shot a considerable chunk of the movie. And the property manager was waiting for an email of mine to come over to authenticate something. And she said, well, why don't you just tell me about what the movie's about while we're rating? I said, oh, well, this is a story about a late discovery adoptee. And she, finds out that she was adopted and she goes on a search to find her birth mother. And the woman on the other end was dead silent. She said, you're not going to believe this. My husband, 2 months ago, was approached by a 30-year-old woman who told him, your girlfriend in high school got pregnant, had a baby, never told you, I'm your daughter. You take for granted how often this has happened. It's just kind of like, oh, that sounds wild. Once we started promoting the film at film festivals, and we really lucked out in terms of how supportive the overall adoption community has been, and, start, meeting them and because I was very, very naive to the broader politics of adoption until I started, having one-on-one conversation with advocates at the film festival. And it just, jaw-dropping to discover all of the controversial elements that can be associated with the experience for somebody.
The same for us. I mean, we really, because Kendall had such a positive experience, even though he'd lost his parents at such a young age, that I don't think he was really thinking about the concept of primal wound. And we didn't know about all the controversies related to it. For several years, we'd even talked about adopting because he felt so positive about adoption and the experience he had that he couldn't fathom us going through a surrogate because there are all these kids out there that they're already here that need a home. And I was one of those babies. But yeah, once we started learning more and more, you're right. Jaw-dropping is the perfect word for it.
It really is amazing how different each person's experience is with it. Obviously from the podcast you did, he obviously had incredibly loving and transparent adoptive parents. There was a friend of mine that I know had been adopted, not late discovery, that I said, hey, I want you to read this. I just want to see what you think about it. And this is someone who was adopted who just kind of shrugged and was like, nah, I really don't see why you think this is a compelling story. And I said, wow, I'm really surprised. He said, look, someone else may have a very different experience. I don't carry a lot of baggage from my stepfather adopting me. And, it is important to remember that sometimes happens, but it's probably not the most common experience, right?
That definitely leads to my next question is that what can you kind of sort of compare and contrast the feedback you've gotten from the adoption community versus people who aren't in the adoption community and maybe don't know anybody close that's gone through that experience?
Really good question. And, let me answer it in the fashion of just the market and how you hopefully market the movie to people and get people to watch it, and also the adoption communities. What I would say in general about Myth of the Ghost Kingdom, which is very common for an independent film, is for anyone who hasn't experienced it, it takes a lot to convince them. Often you'll get a lot of backhanded compliments like, I really didn't think it was really good. I didn't think it could be so good. And you just nod and you're grateful. The core audience, people who've experienced this, again, I knew there was an audience, but there have been several interactions that have been really surprising in that, before we had finished post-production, there were people emailing the website, where can I watch this? I would have to be like, wow, we're about 3 months away from festivals, so you can more than welcome to join us at a festival, or I'll let you know when we go into distribution. So there were definitely people hoping within the community that this was a story that they could identify with, and hoping that it would be authentic. And for the most part, you never know what people are not telling you. But as far as I've seen, we have gotten mostly very, very positive responses. What, as I said in the beginning, has happened a few times, which I fully support, is skepticism. Why are you making this movie? What business do you have? I encourage those questions for any movie like this that is taking someone's story and making it into a narrative. Are we being authentic? And I stand by this. We can get 200 positive reviews, but for someone who feels like this isn't authentic, I want to hear about it. This is a psychological drama, and drama movies right now are not, generally speaking, doing very well. And I did not know that going in to, that's just kind of a trend that's been taking place the past 2 or 3 years. So someone who hasn't experienced this, plus the fact that it's a drama, we were not prepared for how hard of a sell that would be, if you will. Does that make sense?
For sure. And I know you're not the soothsayer, but had you been thinking about this a couple of years ago, maybe going the independent horror route might have been a good idea, because that's just exploding right now. I mean, we're seeing 2 of the biggest movies of the year are made for $1 million or less. And
right. And again, like I said, I imagine what that would be like, but I also wanted to leave room for someone who's really lived it. And I do think that there is a great horror version of that, or a full ahead. I do believe there is an Irish film that's similar, that's a thriller, but I'm not positive. I haven't seen it.
There are people that are having this discovery today, probably literally like right now as we're having this conversation. And they're running the gamut of emotions. They're pissed. They're scared. What would you like that person to take away from Myth of the Ghost Kingdom?
I think the danger, and you probably know this from your partner's experience in going through it, like, you definitely want to, whatever the emotions be, to live with them and think about, why am I angry? I think it's perfectly appropriate to be angry. I think that, that's the interesting thing about anger, though, that, again, to reference your horror podcast, is, underneath anger, there's often shame or hurt, right? And that's really the way a lot of people communicate grief. It's there. The main thing I would say is, if you are angry, that seems perfectly appropriate, but take the time to take care of yourself and unlock what's underneath this anger, right?
Where can listeners watch the movie today?
We are available for rental and purchase on Apple TV and Amazon Prime, and it is currently free with ads for Prime Music. We're doing better than expected, but I think that as the summer progresses, we will probably expand to Tubi and a couple of other distribution channels. But so far, it's done so well, we're just going to keep it pretty simple.
So, Jason, as a listener, you probably know the last question that we typically ask on the show. When you were doing your research or even making the movie, was there a musical artist or song that really helped you get through the process? And I can see guitars in the background, so I know you must have a love of music.
The protagonist in Myth of the Ghost Kingdom becomes a caregiver to take care of her mother. She drops out of school and isn't comfortable, going back to college. She just stumbles into being a caregiver. And as the movie opens, she's considering going back to school, but simultaneously finally getting to the unpleasantry of, organizing her mom's estate. At that point, it was really focused on the caregiver aspect of the protagonist. And the album that I listened to over and over again was Hospice by the indie rock band The Antlers. And it's just a beautiful album. I don't know how popular it is, but it tells the story of the relationship between a caregiver and someone who is slowly dying. And, I just had it on repeat for a good 6 months or anytime I was in the car. And as a matter of fact, when the score was composed, for most of the movie, it was a complete departure of that. But for the big scene where she finds her adoption paper, I was like, I need you to listen to this album. And Scott Gordon, the composer, just absolutely nailed it. He really got close to the kind of feeling that I got from listening to Hospice.
Jason, thank you so much for making this movie. I hope it continues to do, or Kendall and I both hope it continues to do well now that it's out there. We definitely need more fictional representation of the community in a realistic, honest way. So thank you for helping lead that charge.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. And it honestly, you hear this and it sounds dismissive or canned, but it really has been an honor. And especially after connecting with the community at festivals and on social media, it really has been an honor to see the film be received so well. But thank you for having me on the podcast. Great podcast.
Of course. We definitely don't take that lightly. Kendall has said this several times in the podcast. He had no idea, I don't think I had any idea either, how much we both needed this. And so that's been really one of the beautiful things about this experience is getting to know all of these different people and making new friends, like instantly making new friends in the span of half an hour, 45 minutes. That's not taken lightly.
It's an incredibly generous and supportive community, for sure.
Jason, thank you for taking the time to listen to Family Twist before you decided to tell this story. One thing from this conversation that stands out is that you never approached adoption or late discovery as a gimmick. You treated it as what it actually is, an identity earthquake. And for so many people listening today, that's exactly what it feels like. Whether you're an adoptee, an NPE, donor conceived, or someone who loves a person whose family story suddenly changed because of DNA, I hope this episode reminds you that your experiences deserve thoughtful, honest representation. If you'd like to watch Myth of the Ghost Kingdom, it's available on Amazon Prime and Apple TV, and we encourage you to check it out. If this conversation resonated with you, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode with someone who has ever looked in the mirror and wondered where they really came from. Because the more these stories are told with honesty and compassion, the less alone people have to feel. And remember, family secrets are the ultimate plot twist. The Family Twist podcast is produced by Mosaic Multimedia, LLC.